Most people stop right before their life begins to change. Not because they failed, and not because they weren't ready, but because something inside them convinces them to stop at the exact moment things are about to open. If you've ever felt a sudden heaviness, a new doubt, or a strangely convincing reason to slow down just as you were gaining momentum, that isn't random. That is your system trying to return you to what feels safe. And if you don't recognize that moment for what it is, you will keep turning back at the exact point where things were about to change. Think about a time when you were actually moving forward in something that mattered to you. You were consistent, you were focused, and you could feel something starting to build. It wasn't perfect, but it was real progress. Then, without warning, everything inside you shifted. Your mind became louder. Questions started forming that didn't exist before. You began imagining outcomes that felt just real enough to take seriously. What if this doesn't work? What if I'm not ready for what comes next? What if I reach that next level and can't handle it? And the strange part is that those thoughts don't feel like fear. In that moment, they feel like responsibility. Like you're finally seeing things clearly. But those thoughts don't show up when you're doing nothing. They don't appear when you stay inside what's familiar. They don't visit when you avoid growth or stay in patterns you already understand. They show up when something is actually beginning to change. That's the part most people miss. They think the resistance means stop, when in reality, it often means you're getting close. This pattern shows up in very ordinary ways. Someone finally starts taking their work seriously, and right when opportunities begin to appear, they start questioning everything. Someone builds consistency in a habit, and right when it begins to feel stable, they suddenly lose motivation. Someone moves toward a goal they've wanted for years, and just as it begins to become possible, they start doubting whether they even want it anymore. From the outside, it looks like inconsistency. From the inside, it feels like logic. But underneath it, the same thing is happening every time. It's like someone digging for years, putting in the effort, getting closer and closer, and then stopping just 1 centimeter before reaching what they were looking for. Not because the result wasn't there, and not because they lacked the ability, but because something inside them made stopping feel like the right decision. That moment is not about luck, and it's not about the outside world working against you. It's something internal, something built into the way your system operates. Over time, your mind builds patterns around what feels safe, what feels predictable, and what feels manageable. These patterns are formed early, often without you realizing it, through repetition, experience, and what you were exposed to. You learn what is rewarded, what is avoided, what leads to comfort, and what leads to discomfort. And once those patterns are established, they begin to run automatically. Anything that fits within those patterns feels natural. Anything outside of them feels uncertain. The problem is that growth almost always exists outside of what feels familiar. So when you start moving towards something new, something that requires you to think differently, act differently, or take on more responsibility, your system reacts, not with obvious panic, but with subtle interruption. Thoughts that sound reasonable, concerns that feel justified, hesitation that feels responsible. This is where most people turn back because they don't realize what they're actually experiencing. They think they've reached a limit, when in reality, they've reached an edge. And once you start to see that clearly, something uncomfortable begins to surface. You begin to question how many of your decisions have been guided by what feels safe rather than what is actually aligned. You start to notice patterns in your own behavior. Moments where you pulled back even though you could have continued. times where you convinced yourself something wasn't right, when in reality it was just unfamiliar. Situations where you chose what felt comfortable over what could have moved you forward. And this is not about blaming yourself, it's about understanding how your system works. At that point, most people try to solve this by controlling their thoughts. They try to replace negative thoughts with positive ones. They try to motivate themselves, push harder, or force their way through resistance. But that approach doesn't last because thoughts are not operating on their own. They are influenced by your state. If your body feels tense, uncertain, or unsafe, your mind will generate thoughts that match that state. It will create reasons to slow down, to hesitate, or to stop. That's why simply telling yourself to keep going doesn't always work. You can repeat something to yourself over and over, but if your system doesn't feel stable, your mind will continue producing resistance. This is where the real shift begins, not at the level of thought, but at the level of state. Instead of trying to control every thought, you start by changing the condition those thoughts are coming from. You create even a small moment where your system feels less reactive. This doesn't require anything dramatic. It can be as simple as slowing your breathing, stepping away from noise, or placing yourself in an environment where you feel slightly more grounded. The goal is not to eliminate discomfort completely, but to reduce it enough that you can think clearly. Because once your state shifts, even slightly, something else becomes available. You create space between what you feel and how you respond. And in that space, you can begin to observe what's happening instead of reacting automatically. You can notice the urge to stop without immediately obeying it. You can hear the thought without instantly believing it. That is where the pattern begins to break. Not because the resistance disappears, but because it no longer controls your actions. You still feel the hesitation. You still hear the doubt, but you are no longer fully identified with it. You can see it as something happening within you, not something that defines you. This doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually. You notice a moment where you would have stopped before, and this time you continue. You feel the discomfort, but you don't let it decide your next move. You take a step forward even though part of you is still uncertain. And over time, those small decisions begin to shift how you operate. What once felt automatic begins to feel optional. What once controlled your direction begins to lose its influence. And as that happens, something becomes clearer. The goal is not to remove resistance entirely. That's not possible. The goal is to understand it well enough that it no longer determines your direction. Because resistance is not always a signal to stop. Sometimes it is a signal that something new is beginning. And if you don't understand that, you will continue to misread one of the most important moments in your life. You will turn back at the exact point where things were about to open. This is why so many people stay close to progress, but never fully step into it. Not because they lack ability, but because they misinterpret what they feel at the edge. They confuse discomfort with danger. They treat hesitation as truth. And by the time they realize it, they have already stepped back into something familiar. But once you understand what's happening in that moment, your relationship with it changes. You still feel the resistance, but you no longer see it as a command. You see it as a response to change, a response to something new entering your experience. From that point, your focus shifts. Instead of trying to eliminate the resistance, you focus on staying steady enough to continue. You begin to pay attention to what affects your state, the environments you spend time in, the information you consume, the people you engage with, because all of these shape how you feel, and how you feel shapes how you think. Then, From that place, you move anyway. You don't wait for everything to feel perfect. You don't wait for complete certainty. You take the next step with awareness, even if there is still some discomfort present. And over time, that becomes a different way of operating. You are no longer waiting for your mind to become quiet before you act. You are no longer depending on perfect clarity to move forward. You are acting with awareness, even when there is noise. And that changes everything. Because now, resistance doesn't stop you. It becomes something you recognize, something you expect, something that appears when you are close, not when you are far. So when that moment shows up again, and it will, when things feel heavier right before they start to move, when your mind becomes louder just as you were gaining momentum, when something inside you tries to pull you back into what you already know, you don't panic. You don't assume it means you're going the wrong way. You pause, you steady yourself, and you see it clearly. And then you continue. Because that moment is not the end of your progress. It is the edge of it. And most people never cross it, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't understand what they were facing. Now you do, so don't turn back here. Not when you're this close.